This week, I finished the first two seasons of a podcast by Brian McLaren, a teacher and public theologian. The podcast is called Learning How to See. What he and his guests do is talk about 13 biases McLaren has identified, as well as how to recognize our own biases in order to really begin to see. But even then, McLaren says that we will never be able to see everything. Quoting, McLaren says, "We do not see everything, so we do not know everything. We do not know how much we do not know, nor do we know how much of what we know is actually impartial, distorted, or false. This is why we seek to open our eyes, to encounter the world afresh, in humility and in silent wonder, to learn to see," end quote. One of the 13 biases that he identifies is confirmation bias, which occurs when we see things that agree with what we already think. Another is contact bias, which he defines as what other people see that I don't have contact with, I don't see. Our biases, in a way, are tools that we use to provide us with security in an insecure world. This morning's gospel opens with James and John asking Jesus if they can sit on his right and left hand when Jesus enters into his glory. At first glance, this seems like a request to be placed at the top of the pecking order. But to know the context around their question, listen to the two verses that precede our reading this morning. Jesus says to the disciple, "We're going up to Jerusalem. The Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the legal experts. They will condemn him to death and hand him over to the Gentiles. They will ridicule him, spit on him, torture him, and kill him. After 3 days, he will rise up." So maybe, just maybe, James and John, these sons of thunder, are looking for some type of security, some assurance from Jesus that everything will be okay. They are relying on what McLaren would call their consciousness bias, or the bias that is dependent on their level of consciousness or maturity. Some things will be easy to see, some things will be difficult to see, and some things will be impossible to see. Maybe they want assurance that Jesus was just kidding, since they've been following him for 3 years and are part of his inner circle. They just can't see the end that Jesus describes. He's the one to liberate the Jews from captivity of Rome and to put the Jews on top of Rome, Greece, and all the other kingdoms that have conquered the Jews over the centuries. I understand not wanting to see. This week I was talking to Elizabeth, and I told her that until last year, with the murder of George Floyd, I couldn't or wouldn't see how non-white bodies were being treated by people hired to protect them. My biases kept me from seeing. After watching the murder of Mr. Floyd, I can't unsee it. So I began to ask, how do I begin to understand what bodies of color have to deal with in this country every day of their lives? By working through Sacred Ground, the program Sacred Ground with others, I have just scratched the surface of beginning to see. I have just started to understand how my biases have kept me from understanding what is going on in my part of the world. Learning how to see is painful. Jesus calls the disciples together and describes what to expect and the type of leadership that he will be ushering into this world. The Message translates Jesus' lesson as, "You've observed how godless rulers throw their weight around, and when people get a little power, how quickly it goes to their head. It's not going to be that way with you. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant. Whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. That is what the Son of Man has done. He came to serve, not to be served, and then to give away his life in exchange for many who are held hostage." This is the third and last time that Jesus predicts his passion in Mark's gospel. The disciples never got it until after the passion. It's still a hard lesson for Christians to learn. Our presiding bishop calls this way of Jesus the way of love and the way of the cross. For people in this country with privilege and power, it's the way of descent, a downward way. It's a way of life I'm familiar with from the life of St. Francis. Francis grew up privileged in Assisi, but as a young man, he began to learn how to see what following the way of the cross meant for him. He knew that he had to renounce his privilege, his power, his wealth, and his family. Eventually, he knew it meant renouncing anything that detracted him from the love of God. It was a steady downward process of learning how to see what his work was to do. What the disciples expected until after the resurrection was that they would be rewarded by their devotion to Jesus. I imagine that they expected some first century form of what we call the prosperity gospel, which is a complete reversal of the teachings of Jesus. Reverend Nantombi Naomi Tutu writes that while the movement that Jesus started has spread to the four corners of the earth, we have managed to grow the movement without using the teachings of Jesus to change the world. So I asked, how can I use the way of Jesus to change the world? How might I be called to be a servant? Can I continue to learn to see what that looks like and have the courage to work against my own interests? Can I live my baptismal creed, which I affirmed and reaffirm with each baptism, to seek and serve Christ in all people? Can I strive for a new kind of kingdom where the last will be first? This is hard work that we are called to, but we are promised that we aren't alone in this work. I'll close this morning with a slight paraphrase of a portion of a prayer that's been attributed to St. Francis. This may be one way to walk the way of love. God, grant that we may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to new life. Amen.